There are moments in human history so charged with consequence, so loaded with meaning, that they seem to vibrate even across the distance of 2,000 years. Moments that refuse to stay in the past, that keep reaching forward into every generation, demanding to be examined, wrestled with, and understood. Moments that feel, even now, even today, as though they just happened, as though the dust has not quite settled, as though the echo is still moving through the air. The trial of Jesus Christ before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate is one of those moments, perhaps the greatest of all those moments. It is a scene that has been painted by the masters of the Renaissance, debated by the greatest minds of Western philosophy, dramatized in theater and cinema, and whispered in the prayers of believers across every continent and in every century. It is a scene that most people, and even those with no Christian faith, even those who have never opened a Bible in their lives, know by heart, at least in outline. A Roman governor, a Jewish prisoner, a crowd, a basin of water, a terrible, irreversible verdict, and at the center of it all, a question that has never been fully answered to everyone's satisfaction. What is truth? But today, we are not simply going to rehearse the drama of the trial and move on. We are going to go deep, deeper than most tellings of this story ever go. We're going to trace the full arc of the man at the center of the political machinery of that morning, Pontius Pilate himself. We're going to ask who he really was, where he came from, what kind of man he had become by the time Jesus stood before him, what forces had shaped him, what pressures were closing in around him, what he actually said and did during the trial, and, crucially, what happened to him after the cross. After Jerusalem, after the moment that defined his legacy forever, because Pontius Pilate's story does not end when he walks back inside after the crowd has gotten what it wanted. His story continues, and the way it continues, the arc it follows, the destination it arrives at, is one of the most sobering and instructive narratives in all of ancient history. This is a story about power without integrity, about knowledge without courage, about the devastating cost of choosing what is safe over what is right. It is a story about a man who had the opportunity of a lifetime, literally the opportunity of eternity, and who squandered it because the crowd was too loud and his career was too important. But it is also a story about grace, about how even the worst decisions, even the darkest moments, even the most catastrophic moral failures are somehow woven into the tapestry of God's redemptive purposes. About how the cross that Pilate authorized became the salvation of the world. So stay with us, because by the time we reach the end of this journey, you will never say those words from the Apostles' Creed, "Suffered under Pontius Pilate." The same way again, they will carry new weight, new texture, new meaning, and you will understand, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that the gospel is not a comfortable story. It is a true story. And true stories are always more demanding, more costly, and more glorious than comfortable ones. Before we begin this journey in earnest, I want to take a moment, just a moment, to acknowledge you. Yes, you, the person watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, and I genuinely mean that because this community spans the globe in a way that never ceases to fill my heart with gratitude. I am so glad you are here. Would you do something for me right now? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your city, your country, your corner of the world. I read these comments and I love them. We have people watching from the United States and the United Kingdom, from Brazil and Nigeria, from the Philippines and South Korea, from Australia and New Zealand, from India and South Africa, from Canada and Germany and France, and everywhere in between. Every time I see those comments, I am reminded that what we are doing here is something genuinely global. a conversation about the Word of God that crosses every border, every language, every cultural divide. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, I want to ask you, from my heart, with complete sincerity, not as a formality but as a genuine request, please subscribe. Right now, hit that button. This channel exists to go deep into Scripture, to explore the history and the theology and the archaeology and the human stories behind the Word of God. If that is something that nourishes your soul, then you belong here. This is your community. We are building something real, a global family of people who are hungry for truth, who want more than surface-level Bible engagement, who want their faith to be grounded in both passion and knowledge. And if you want to go even further, if you want to be part of the inner circle of this community, I warmly invite you to become a channel member. Members get early access to videos before they go public, which means you get to be first into these deep conversations. You become part of a community within the community, people from all over the world, united by a shared love for God's Word. The join button is right below this video. It would mean the world to me to have you there. Now, let's talk about Pontius Pilate. Let's really talk about him. Part 1. The empire that shaped the man. To understand Pontius Pilate, truly understand him not just as a villain in a passion play, but as a complex, historically situated human being. You have to understand the world that produced him, because no one arrives at their defining moment in a vacuum. Every person who stands at a crossroads carries with them all the roads they have already traveled, all the choices they have already made, all the values they have already formed, all the pressures they have already learned to navigate. And Pilate's world was Rome. Rome, in the early 1st century of the Common Era, was the greatest human empire the ancient world had ever seen. Stretch a map of the Mediterranean across your mind's eye and consider the scope of it, from the island of Britain in the far northwest, cold and rain-soaked and barely pacified, to the scorched edge of the Arabian desert in the southeast. From the Atlantic coast of Spain and Portugal in the west to the frontiers of Armenia and Mesopotamia in the east. From the Rhine and Danube rivers in northern Europe to the deserts and savannas of North Africa. All of it, every city, every road, every port, every river crossing, every mountain pass, under Roman control. At its height, the Roman Empire governed somewhere between 60 and 90 million people, a quarter of the world's entire population, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods. Organized into provinces, client kingdoms, and satellite states, all held together by the extraordinary machinery of Roman administration, Roman law, Roman military power, and Roman engineering. The roads. Think about the roads. Rome's engineers built a network of roads that stretched for over 40,000 miles across 3 continents, paved, straight, engineered to last, and they did last, because some of those roads are still visible today, nearly 2,000 years after they were built. Those roads were not just infrastructure, they were statements. They were the physical embodiment of Roman power, Roman permanence, Roman reach. They were how the legions moved, how the governors traveled, how the tax collectors arrived, how the messages went from Rome to the edges of the known world and came back again. And at the center of all of this was the emperor. In Pilate's time, that emperor was Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, successor to the great Augustus Caesar, who had transformed the Roman Republic into an empire. Tiberius was a complex, difficult, deeply suspicious man. Brilliant as a military commander, effective as an administrator in his earlier years, but increasingly paranoid and reclusive as he aged. By the time of Jesus' trial, Tiberius had largely withdrawn from public life to his villa on the island of Capri, leaving much of the day-to-day running of the empire to trusted lieutenants and leaving Rome itself vulnerable to the machinations of powerful men like Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, who for years functioned as a kind of shadow emperor. To serve in the Roman imperial system was to exist in a world of extraordinary power and extraordinary danger. The opportunities were immense: wealth, prestige, authority, influence, but the risks were equally immense. Fall out of favor with the emperor, back the wrong political faction, fail to maintain order in your province, allow a major incident to occur on your watch, and you could find yourself stripped of everything: your position, your property, your freedom, your life. This was the world that Pontius Pilate inhabited. This was the air he breathed, the language he thought in, the calculus he applied to every decision, and understanding that calculus is essential to understanding why he did what he did on the morning Jesus stood before him. Part 2. The man behind the title. So who was Pontius Pilate as an individual? This is where history is both fascinating and frustratingly incomplete. He is one of the most recognized names in Western civilization, recognized by Christians and non-Christians alike, referenced in art and philosophy and literature across 20 centuries. And yet, the personal details of his life are surprisingly sparse. Ancient sources give us enough to sketch a portrait, but not enough to fill in every corner. His name itself tells us something. The name Pontius was a family name, what the Romans called a nomen, the name identifying a particular family clan. The Pontii were an old Samnite family, the Samnites being an Italic people who had once been fierce enemies of Rome, but who had long since been absorbed into Roman society and culture. By the 1st century, the Pontii were a thoroughly Romanized family with generations of service to the Roman system behind them. The name Pilate, Pilatus in Latin, is more interesting and more debated. An ancient tradition derives it from the Latin word pilum, meaning a javelin or a heavy throwing spear, the distinctive weapon of the Roman legionary. A pilatus, in this reading, would be one who carried or was associated with the pilum, perhaps indicating military service in the family's background, or even a physical characteristic of an ancestor who fought with distinction using this weapon. Another tradition derives the name from the Latin pileatus, referring to someone who wore the pileus, a type of felt cap worn by freed slaves in Rome, indicating a family that at some point had been freedmen who gained citizenship. Scholars debate which etymology is correct, and the truth is that we cannot be entirely certain. What we can be more certain about is his social class. Pilate was a member of the equestrian order, the equites, Rome's military and administrative nobility. The equestrian class sat just below the senatorial class in the Roman social hierarchy. They were not quite the top tier. That belonged to the senators, the old aristocratic families who sat in the Senate and considered themselves the true inheritors of the Roman Republic's noble tradition. But the equites were absolutely elite by any normal measure. They were wealthy, educated, connected, and ambitious. Many of the most important administrative positions in the empire were filled by equestrians: financial procurators, military tribunes, provincial prefects. These were the men who actually ran the day-to-day machinery of empire. To reach the equestrian order, a man needed both wealth, a minimum property qualification, and either birth into an equestrian family or elevation by the emperor's favor. To maintain his place in the order and advance within it, he needed to demonstrate competence, loyalty, and the ability to carry out Rome's mandate in whatever post he was assigned. Pilate had clearly done all of this. He had risen to the rank of prefect, a military governor, and had been assigned to Judea, one of the most demanding and politically sensitive provinces in the entire empire. That was not a posting given to unproven men. Before taking up his post as prefect of Judea, Pilate had almost certainly served in the Roman military. Prefects, especially those governing provinces with a significant military dimension as Judea did, were expected to have direct military experience. They commanded auxiliary forces. They dealt with potential insurrections and border security. They were administrators, yes, but first they were soldiers. Men who understood command, discipline, the psychology of troops, and the logistics of maintaining security across a diverse and sometimes hostile population. There is a tradition, preserved in some ancient sources and developed by later writers, that Pilate had served with distinction in campaigns in Germania, the wild, forested territories east of the Rhine that Rome perpetually struggled to fully pacify. Whether this specific detail is historically reliable is difficult to confirm, but the general picture of a man with solid military experience, good political connections, and the ambition to rise through the ranks of imperial service is almost certainly accurate. He was, in every sense, a Roman establishment man. He was also a married man. His wife, unnamed in the canonical Gospels but identified as Claudia Procula in later Christian tradition, appears briefly but powerfully in Matthew's account of the trial, and her appearance is one of the most striking details in the entire narrative. We will return to her because she deserves far more attention than she typically receives. Pilate was probably in his late 30s or early 40s when he arrived in Judea. He was not a young idealist on his first posting. He was a man who had already navigated the complexities and dangers of Roman imperial service for many years. He was pragmatic, experienced, and fully aware of what his role required. He was also, as we will discover, a man who carried within him some spark of moral perception, the ability to recognize truth and justice when he encountered them, combined with a deep and ultimately fatal unwillingness to pay the cost of acting on that recognition. Part 3. Judea. The province that broke Governor Pilate's posting to Judea was, by any measure, one of the most challenging in the Roman provincial system, and to understand why, you have to understand what Judea was in the first century, politically, religiously, and culturally. The land of Israel had been under Roman influence since the mid-1st century before Christ, when the Roman general Pompey had marched his legions into Jerusalem in 63 BC, and desecrated the temple by entering the Holy of Holies. That moment, a pagan general, walking uninvited into the most sacred space in Judaism, had set the tone for the relationship between Rome and the Jewish people for the next century and beyond. The Jewish people never forgot it, and they never fully forgave it. Under the client king Herod the Great, who ruled from approximately 37 to 4 BC, Judea had experienced a period of relative stability maintained through a combination of brutal political control and spectacular building projects. Herod was a complicated figure, half Idumean, only partly Jewish by ancestry, deeply insecure about his legitimacy in Jewish eyes, and ferociously capable as a builder and political operator. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem on a scale of magnificence that made it one of the wonders of the ancient world. He built the magnificent Roman port city of Caesarea Maritima. He constructed fortresses, palaces, aqueducts, and amphitheaters throughout his territory. He was, in short, a man who built magnificently while ruling ruthlessly. After Herod's death, his kingdom was divided among his sons. The territory of Judea, along with Samaria and Idumea, was initially given to his son Archelaus. But Archelaus proved so incompetent and brutal that delegations of both Jews and Samaritans went to Rome to complain about him. And in AD 6, the Emperor Augustus removed him and converted Judea into a Roman province governed directly by Roman prefects. This was the province Pilate inherited when he was appointed in approximately AD 26. And it was a province with a unique set of challenges that had already consumed politically, and in some cases literally, several of his predecessors. The core challenge was this: the Jewish people were unlike any other group the Romans governed anywhere in the empire. The Roman imperial system had a remarkable capacity for tolerance. It did not, as a matter of policy, require conquered peoples to abandon their gods, their traditions, or their ways of life. As long as you paid your taxes, maintained order, and acknowledged the ultimate authority of Rome, and, under most emperors, offered at least nominal veneration to the imperial cult, Rome was largely content to let you be. This tolerance was what made the empire function across such an enormous cultural diversity. But the Jewish people posed a unique challenge to this system. Their faith was not simply one religion among many in the empire's marketplace of deities. It was a comprehensive worldview, a total claim on every aspect of life: political, economic, social, ceremonial, dietary, relational. And at the absolute center of that worldview was the radical, non-negotiable monotheism that had distinguished Israel since Abraham. There is one God, not one God among many, not the chief God in a hierarchy of gods. One God alone, without rival, without image, without competition. This meant that for deeply observant Jewish people, the standard Roman expectations: worship the emperor, honor the Roman gods, participate in the civic religious life of the empire, were not merely inconvenient, but literally impossible. They would not worship Caesar, they would not bow to images, they would not participate in the sacrifices that undergirded Roman public life. These were not preferences or cultural practices they were willing to negotiate away. They were the absolute bedrock of their identity as the people of God. Previous Roman governors of Judea had learned the hard way what this meant in practice. You could not simply impose Roman standards on this population and expect compliance. You could not ignore Jewish religious sensitivities and expect peace. You were governing a people who would, if pushed far enough, die rather than compromise their faith. And that created an administrative challenge unlike anything the Romans faced elsewhere. The Jewish population of Judea was also not politically passive. Far from it. Across the first century, there were multiple movements and individuals who challenged Roman authority in various ways. From the peaceful but firm religious resistance of the Pharisees to the more politically charged nationalism of the Zealots. From the apocalyptic expectations of various messianic movements to the outright revolutionary violence of groups like the Sicarii. The province was, in modern terms, a tinderbox. Not always on fire, but always capable of igniting. And Pilate arrived in this tinderbox with what appears to have been, at least initially, something less than complete appreciation for what he was walking into. Part 4. The Man in Stone. Archaeological Confirmation. Before we go further into the historical narrative, I want to take a moment to address something that is deeply significant, both historically and theologically. For centuries, and with renewed force in the skeptical atmosphere of modern scholarship, some critics questioned whether the New Testament's account of Pontius Pilate could be trusted. Not necessarily whether Pilate existed at all, but whether his title, his role, and the specific details the Gospels give about him were accurate. Were the Gospel writers reliable historians? Were they working from real information or constructing a narrative around a vaguely remembered name? In 1961, archaeology gave a definitive answer. A team of Italian archaeologists was conducting excavations at the ancient Roman theatre at Caesarea Maritima, the magnificent coastal city that had been Herod's greatest building achievement and that Pilate used as his primary residence during his governorship. In the course of their work, they uncovered a stone slab that had been reused as a step in a later construction, as so often happens with ancient materials. The stone was damaged, but the surviving portion of the inscription carved into it was clear enough to read and to reconstruct with reasonable confidence. The inscription, now known universally in scholarship as the Pilate stone or the Caesarea inscription, reads, in reconstruction, something very close to the divine Augusti, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated. A Tiberium was a building or structure dedicated in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. Pilate was publicly dedicating such a structure to the people of Caesarea. The key words are the ones that matter for our purposes. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. There it was, carved in stone, by a craftsman in Caesarea Maritima, probably sometime between AD 26 and 36. The name, the title, the place, exactly as the Gospels describe him. The stone is now housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where it can be viewed by visitors from around the world. It is one of the most significant single pieces of archaeological evidence related to the New Testament that has ever been discovered, not because it proves the theological claims of Christianity. Archaeology cannot do that, and it is not the job of archaeology to do that, but because it establishes, with the kind of certainty that only physical evidence provides, that the people, places, and institutional structures described in the Gospels were real. Pontius Pilate was not a literary invention. He was a historical person with a real title, in a real place, during a real period of history. There is something extraordinarily moving about looking at a photograph of that stone, or, better yet, standing in front of it in person and letting the reality sink in. This is his name, Pontius Pilate, the man who stood face to face with Jesus, the man who asked, "What is truth?" the man who washed his hands. His name in the stone he dedicated in the city where he lived. History is not abstract. It happened. These people were real. That morning was real. Part 5. Trouble from the start. Pilate's fraught. Early governorship. From almost the moment Pontius Pilate arrived in Judea as its governor, his relationship with the Jewish population began to generate friction. And this is not a minor background detail. It is essential context for understanding everything that happened later, including the trial of Jesus. Because by the time Jesus was brought before him, Pilate was not a neutral judge with no prior history in this province. He was a man with a complicated, troubled, and in some ways deeply compromised record of governance. A man who had already been outmaneuvered, pressured, and, at least once, formally rebuked by the emperor himself. The first serious incident of his governorship, as recorded by the Jewish historian Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, involved the military standards bearing the image of the emperor. This was a long-standing and well-understood issue in Judea. Jewish law prohibited the making or display of images. The second commandment was clear and was taken seriously. Previous Roman governors had respected this by removing the imperial images from the military standards before entering Jerusalem. It was a small accommodation, a diplomatic gesture that cost Rome essentially nothing but bought considerable goodwill with the Jewish population. Pilate decided, either out of deliberate provocation, tactical calculation, or simple disregard for the sensitivities of his subjects, to end this accommodation. When he brought his troops to Jerusalem for their winter quarters, something that happened annually, he ordered them to march in at night, quietly, under cover of darkness, carrying the full standards with the emperor's image. The secrecy suggests that even Pilate knew this was likely to cause problems. He hoped perhaps to present the population with a fait accompli. Standards already in the city, already established, too late to object. He was wrong. When morning came and the people of Jerusalem discovered what had happened, the reaction was immediate and intense. A crowd of Jewish men organized themselves and made the journey to Caesarea, where Pilate was residing. They surrounded his house and demanded, respectfully but absolutely, that the standards be removed from Jerusalem. This was not a small delegation. Josephus describes it as a multitude of people who besieged the palace for 5 days and 5 nights. 5 days. These were not professional protesters with nothing else to do. These were ordinary men, many of them with families and businesses and fields to tend, who felt so strongly about the violation of their religious law that they left everything for almost a week to press their case. They were, in the deepest sense, willing to suffer for their conviction. On the 6th day, Pilate summoned them to a large open space, possibly an arena or a public gathering area, and surrounded them with soldiers with orders to cut them down if they did not accept the standards and go home. The response of the crowd was one of the most extraordinary acts of non-violent resistance in the ancient world. They threw themselves on the ground, bared their necks, and declared that they were ready to die rather than see their laws violated. They would accept death before dishonor. Pilate found himself looking at hundreds or thousands of men prepared to be massacred on his order. And he blinked. He ordered the standards removed from Jerusalem. The crowd had won. It was a significant moment, in more ways than one. On the surface, it was a victory for Jewish religious conviction over Roman arrogance. But it was also something else. It was a demonstration, written in vivid detail in the political memory of both Pilate and the Jewish leadership, that Pilate could be pressured, that he could be made to back down, that if you pushed hard enough, made the cost of his position high enough, he would retreat. That information would prove enormously significant years later, when the religious leaders needed to leverage Pilate into condemning Jesus. The second major incident of Pilate's governorship, also recorded by Josephus, involved the temple treasury. Jerusalem's water supply was a chronic problem. The ancient city sat on a rocky hilltop without a reliable natural water source nearby. Pilate conceived or endorsed a plan to build an aqueduct that would bring fresh water into the city from a distance of many miles. In many respects, this was actually a sensible and beneficial public works project. Jerusalem needed water. An aqueduct would solve a real problem. The issue was the funding. Pilate chose to fund the aqueduct using money from the Corban, the temple treasury, the sacred funds that had been dedicated to God and to the temple's operation. From a strictly practical Roman perspective, this may have seemed reasonable. The aqueduct would benefit Jerusalem, including the temple and its operations. So why not fund it from Jerusalem's most available large reserve of capital? From a Jewish religious perspective, it was an outrage. Sacred money, money dedicated to God, was being appropriated without authorization for a secular construction project. It was a desecration. When Pilate came to Jerusalem during the work, angry crowds gathered to confront him. This time, his response was not accommodation, but violence. He had dressed soldiers in civilian clothing, armed with concealed clubs, and placed them in the crowd. When the protest intensified, the soldiers attacked. Many people were beaten. Some were killed. The crowd was dispersed by force. The contrast between these two incidents is instructive. In the first case and the standards, he backed down when faced with mass, sustained, non-violent resistance. In the second case, the temple treasury, he met protest with pre-planned violence. The two responses seem contradictory, but they share a common logic. In both cases, Pilate was making a calculation about what would serve his interests and protect his position. When backing down was the less costly option, he backed down. When he thought he could suppress the opposition with a quick show of force, he used force. His responses were not driven by principle, but by calculation. There is also the incident referenced briefly in the Gospel of Luke, one of the most chilling details about Pilate in the entire New Testament. In Luke 13:1, Jesus is told about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. This describes an incident in which Pilate had Jewish pilgrims killed in the very act of offering sacrifices, an almost incomprehensible desecration of what was, for any observant Jew, the most sacred possible activity. We do not know the full context of this incident. It may have been connected to a political or religious disturbance that Pilate was suppressing. But the image it evokes, soldiers sent into a place of worship to kill people in the act of prayer, tells us something important about the kind of governance Pilate was capable of. Part 6. Philo of Alexandria and the Portrait that Endures. We have one more major ancient source to consider before we come to the trial itself, and it is one of the most vivid and unsparing portraits of Pilate from any non-Christian, non-Josephus source. It comes from Philo of Alexandria, the remarkable Jewish philosopher who lived from roughly 20 BC to AD 50, who was a contemporary of both Jesus and Pilate, and who synthesized Jewish theology with Greek philosophical thought in ways that would influence Christian theology for centuries. Philo was not writing a neutral historical account. He was writing in a context of advocacy, a formal appeal to the Roman Emperor Caligula on behalf of the Jewish people in Alexandria who were experiencing persecution. In this work, known as Legatio ad Gaium, or Embassy to Gaius, Philo includes what purports to be a letter from King Herod Agrippa I to Caligula, in which Herod describes Pilate in extraordinarily harsh terms. The passage lists Pilate's vices systematically: briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, wanton injuries, executions without trial, and ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. Whether every detail of this characterization is historically accurate in every respect is debatable. Philo was, as we said, writing advocacy, not neutral history. But even accounting for rhetorical inflation, the fact that a contemporaneous Jewish writer, whose community had every reason to pay attention to events in Judea, described Pilate in these terms, and that this description aligns broadly with what Josephus tells us about specific incidents, gives it significant weight. Philo also describes a specific incident that is particularly relevant: the affair of the gilded shields. Pilate ordered golden shields bearing an inscription honoring Tiberius to be set up in the palace of Herod in Jerusalem. Unlike the standards controversy, these shields apparently did not bear images. They were inscribed shields, not image-bearing standards. But they were still seen as an imposition of Roman imperial religious language into a Jewish religious space, and the reaction was fierce. 4 of Herod's sons, prominent members of the Herodian family with significant standing in the Roman political system, formally protested and eventually sent a petition directly to the Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius's response was swift and sharp. He wrote to Pilate, rebuking him severely, and ordered the shields transferred to Caesarea, where they could be displayed in the temple of Augustus without causing offense. They were removed from Jerusalem. This incident is enormously significant for our understanding of the trial of Jesus. It means that by the time Jesus was brought before him, probably around AD 30 or 33, Pilate had already been formally rebuked by the emperor. He had already demonstrated that he was capable of making politically costly errors in Judea. He was already, in the language of Roman politics, a man whose position was not entirely secure. His record in the province had attracted negative attention at the highest level of the imperial government. In this context, the threat the chief priests leveled at him during the trial of Jesus, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend," takes on even greater weight than it might otherwise have. Those words were not empty rhetoric. They were a surgical strike aimed at Pilate's most vulnerable point, and the chief priests knew exactly how vulnerable it was. Part 7. The morning of the trial, setting the scene. It was early. Very early. The city of Jerusalem was already dense with people. It was Passover, the greatest annual pilgrimage festival of the Jewish calendar, the feast that commemorated the exodus from Egypt, the founding event of Israel's identity as a nation freed by God from bondage. Scholars estimate that Jerusalem's normal population of perhaps 20 to 30,000 residents could swell to several times that number during the major pilgrimage festivals. The streets were crowded, the air was charged. The city was alive with religious energy, with the prayers and chanting and singing of hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who had come from across the Jewish world. From the diaspora communities in Rome, Alexandria, Babylon, and beyond. To be in the holy city for this holy time, it was the kind of atmosphere that made Roman governors deeply nervous. Large crowds, religious fervor, compressed space, historical grievances. These were the ingredients of trouble. Pilate had almost certainly come up from Caesarea Maritima specifically because of the festival. His presence in Jerusalem during Passover was essentially a security measure, a visible reminder of Roman authority at the time of year when tensions were most likely to boil over. And he woke up that morning, or was woken up, to news that a prisoner had been brought to the Praetorium. The Praetorium was his official residence in Jerusalem, located most likely in the old Herodian palace on the western edge of the city, though some scholars have argued for the Antonia fortress adjacent to the Temple Mount. The prisoner had been delivered by the Jewish religious authorities, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, and they wanted a Roman execution. Now, Pilate had almost certainly heard of Jesus before this morning. That needs to be said clearly. Jesus of Nazareth had not been a quiet, obscure figure whose existence had somehow escaped the notice of the Roman governor's intelligence network. Quite the opposite. For months, possibly years, Jesus had been drawing enormous crowds throughout Galilee and Judea. His teaching was unlike anything people had heard. His miracles, the healing of the sick, the giving of sight to the blind, the raising of the dead, were public events, witnessed by large numbers of people, and talked about everywhere. His reputation had spread throughout the region, and the talk was not quiet. And then, just days before this morning, Jesus had done something that could not possibly have escaped Pilate's attention. He had entered Jerusalem in what can only be described as a deliberate, carefully staged messianic procession. Riding on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9 that the King of Israel would come to Jerusalem riding on a donkey, humble and victorious, Jesus had come down from the Mount of Olives as crowds lined the road, cutting branches, throwing down their cloaks and shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" The whole city, Matthew tells us, was stirred, literally shaken. The Greek word is the one used for an earthquake. The whole city was in an uproar. For a Roman governor with his hands full managing a volatile city during the most charged week of the Jewish religious year, the public messianic procession into Jerusalem of a man with a large following would have been noted immediately. And then, the very next day, Jesus had gone to the temple, the most sensitive single location in all of Judea, and caused a scene. He had overturned the tables of the money changers. He had driven out those who were selling animals for sacrifice. He had quoted Isaiah and Jeremiah, calling the temple a house of prayer that had been made into a den of thieves. Pilate knew who Jesus was. When the religious leaders brought him to the Praetorium that morning, they were not introducing a stranger. They were presenting a figure Pilate had probably been monitoring for some time. But the charges they brought were framed in a specific way. Not, "He claimed to be the Messiah." Pilate would have had little interest in Jewish messianic theology. Not, "He violated our religious law." That was a matter for Jewish courts, not Roman ones. No, they framed the charges in political terms. Jesus was subverting the nation. He was forbidding the payment of tribute to Caesar. and he was claiming to be a king. It was that last charge, the claim of kingship, that was designed to get traction with a Roman governor. In Rome's world, kings did not arise in Roman provinces without Roman authorization. A man who claimed to be a king without Roman sanction was, by definition, claiming political authority that challenged Caesar's sovereignty. That was treason. That was the kind of charge that required a Roman response. Pilate accepted the prisoner and began his inquiry. Part 8. The Interrogation. Truth stands before power. What followed was one of the most extraordinary encounters in all of recorded history. Pilate took Jesus inside the praetorium, away from the crowd, away from the chief priests, into a private space, and questioned him. The Gospel of John gives us the most detailed account of what was said, and it reads not like a legal interrogation, but like a collision between two entirely different conceptions of reality. Pilate's first question was direct and expected. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus' response was not a simple yes or no. It was something that immediately reframed the entire conversation. He said, in John's account, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Sit with the profundity of that statement. Jesus was not denying that he was a king. He was denying that his kingship fit into any of the categories Pilate was used to working with. He was not claiming the kind of political, military, territorial authority that Rome understood as kingship. He was claiming something that operated in a different register entirely. A kingdom not from this world, not built by armies or held together by taxation, not subject to Roman authorization because it derived its legitimacy from a source Rome had no access to. This must have been deeply disorienting for Pilate. He was trained to deal with political reality, with power, with the negotiable world of Roman governance, and this prisoner was speaking about a kingdom that was completely outside that world, yet clearly real, clearly important, clearly something the prisoner was staking his life on. Pilate pressed, "Are you a king then? You are saying something about kingship. Are you claiming to be a king?" And Jesus' answer was breathtaking in its directness. "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." He was not deflecting, he was not hedging, he was saying, "Yes, I am a king. And the purpose of my kingship, the reason I came into this world, is to bear witness to the truth, to testify to it, to embody it, and those who belong to the truth hear me." And then Pilate asked the question that has echoed through the centuries, the question that has become a touchstone of philosophical reflection and theological contemplation. The question that, in its context, is simultaneously intellectually alive and spiritually devastating. What is truth? He asked it and walked away. He turned and went back outside without waiting for a response. Whether this was dismissal, the weary cynicism of a practical man who had no time for philosophical speculation, or genuine existential confusion, the honest bewilderment of a man confronted with something that did not fit his categories, or something else entirely, the text does not explicitly tell us, but the dramatic irony is unbearable. The man asking, "What is truth?" was standing in front of the one who had said in that same night to his disciples, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Not a truth, not a messenger of truth, not a teacher who knew some truths, the truth, the ground of all reality, the bedrock of existence. Truth was standing right in front of him, speaking directly to him, and Pilate walked away. When he went back outside, he announced his verdict. "I find no fault in him at all." It was unambiguous. He had questioned the prisoner. He had tested his claims. He had listened to the charges and investigated them against the man who stood before him. And his conclusion, as a Roman magistrate trained in law and justice, was clear. This man has done nothing that warrants death under Roman law. No fault, none. It was both a legal verdict and a moral statement. And it was the beginning of one of the most tragic reversals of justice in human history, because having declared the man innocent, Pilate would spend the rest of the morning trying to find a way to satisfy those who wanted him dead. Part 9. The Wife's Warning. A voice from another world. While the interrogation of Jesus and the negotiations with the crowd were ongoing, something happened that is recorded only in the Gospel of Matthew, and that remains one of the most evocative and haunting details in the entire Passion narrative. It is a detail that is easy to skip past, but that richly rewards attention. Matthew 27:19 tells us, "While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, 'Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him.'" His wife. She sent him a message. She was not there in the public proceedings. Roman women of high social status would not have been present in the public forum of a Roman legal proceeding, particularly in a foreign province. She was somewhere in the praetorium, in the private quarters of the governor's residence, and in the night, in her sleep, she had had a dream about Jesus, and the dream had caused her to suffer. The Greek word Matthew uses has connotations of distress, affliction, anguish. She had suffered in the dream because of this man, and her response was immediate. She reached out to her husband right in the middle of the proceedings to warn him. "Do not do this. Have nothing to do with this just man." A just man. That was her description. Not an interesting man, or a powerful man, or a dangerous man. A just man. Innocent. Righteous. Do not touch him. Her name is not given in Matthew's Gospel. Christian tradition, particularly in the Eastern churches, gives her the name Claudia Procula, sometimes simply Procla. She is venerated as a saint in the Coptic Orthodox Church, which celebrates a feast day for her on June 25th. Ethiopian and Greek Orthodox traditions also have positive traditions about her. Whether she became a Christian after the events of the Passion is something we cannot confirm with certainty from historical records, but the tradition is ancient and widespread enough to take seriously. What is remarkable about her brief appearance in the narrative is the way it multiplies the weight of Pilate's guilt. Consider what he had by this point: the evidence of his own interrogation, which had led him to conclude that Jesus was innocent. The message from his wife, herself clearly shaken by something extraordinary in her dreams, warning him to stay away from this just man. Two independent sources of testimony pointing in exactly the same direction. And he had these while the crowd was shouting, while the chief priests were pressing, while the political pressure was building. He had every reason to do the right thing, and he did not. What was Claudia Procula dreaming? The text does not tell us. It tells us only that she suffered greatly, that the dream was connected to Jesus, that she was moved enough, troubled enough, alarmed enough to interrupt the public proceedings with a personal message to her husband. Whatever she experienced in the dream realm that night, it left her with one clear conviction: this man is just. Do not harm him. The wife of Pontius Pilate saw more clearly than her husband did. She could not save Jesus. That was never going to be stopped, because the cross was always the destination. But she could see who Jesus was, and her testimony, delivered through a dream she had not asked for, stands in the gospel record as one of the most unexpected confessions in the entire Passion story. Even the governor's wife bore witness to the innocence of the Son of God. Part 10. Barabbas and the crowd. The choice that defines the Passover amnesty custom, the practice of releasing one prisoner to the people during the festival, gave Pilate what he may have thought was an elegant way out. He could offer the crowd a choice, Jesus or Barabbas. Pilate may well have believed, or at least hoped, that the crowd would choose Jesus. That the general population, the ordinary Passover pilgrims, the people who had lined the road during the triumphal entry, the crowds who had followed Jesus throughout his ministry, would choose a popular teacher and healer over a violent insurrectionist. He had miscalculated, or rather, he had not accounted for the organizational capacity of the chief priests who had been working the crowd. Matthew 27:20 tells us explicitly, "The chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." This was not a spontaneous popular uprising against Jesus. It was an organized campaign driven by the religious leadership who had the connections, the authority, and the incentive to turn public opinion in the direction they needed it to go. Barabbas is a fascinating and somewhat mysterious figure. His name in Aramaic means son of the father, Bar Abba. Some manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel actually give his full name as Jesus Barabbas, Jesus, son of the Father. The parallel is striking and theologically charged. The crowd chose a man named Son of the Father over the one who was in truth the Son of the Father. They chose a violent revolutionary over the Prince of Peace. They chose a man imprisoned for insurrection and murder over a man who had never harmed anyone, who had healed the sick and raised the dead and fed the hungry and given sight to the blind. When the crowd shouted for Barabbas, Pilate was genuinely taken aback. "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" he asked. And the crowd's answer was immediate and unanimous. "Let him be crucified." Pilate pushed back, perhaps one final time, perhaps with genuine discomfort. "Why? What evil has he done?" But the crowd only grew louder, their shouts intensifying, the noise becoming overwhelming, the possibility of a riot becoming more real with every passing moment. And then came the threat that ended Pilate's resistance. "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar, not Caesar's friend." In the political language of first-century Rome, that phrase carried lethal weight. Amicus Caesaris, friend of Caesar, was both a formal designation of political status and an informal but crucial measure of how secure your position was in the imperial system. To lose the friendship of Caesar, to be seen as disloyal, incompetent, or complicit in anti-imperial activity, was not merely an embarrassment. It was potentially the beginning of the end. And for a man who had already been formally rebuked by Tiberius over the Shields affair, who had already generated reports to Rome about his governance of Judea, who was already on thin administrative ice, the threat was not abstract. It was existential. And in the face of that threat, Pilate made his choice, not the right choice, not the just choice, the safe choice. The choice that protected his career, his position, his standing with Rome, his place in the imperial hierarchy that had given him everything he had. He chose himself over justice. He chose safety over truth, and the Son of God was handed over to be crucified. Part 11. The Handwashing. Ceremony cannot cleanse conscience. Matthew 27:24-26 is one of the most theatrical and most psychologically revealing passages in the entire Passion narrative. It reads, "When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, 'I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it.' And all the people answered and said, 'His blood be on us and on our children.' Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." The handwashing. It is one of the most universally recognized symbolic gestures in Western cultural history. The image of Pilate with the basin of water, publicly washing his hands of the responsibility for what was about to happen, has become a metaphor for moral abdication so powerful that we still use the phrase washing one's hands of, something to mean refusing to take responsibility for it. But what was Pilate actually doing? And did it work, even on his own terms? The gesture appears to be borrowed from Jewish ceremonial tradition. Deuteronomy 21 describes a ritual in which the elders of a city were to wash their hands over a heifer to declare their innocence when an unidentified murder victim was found in the vicinity. The washing of hands was a public declaration of non-involvement in the blood that had been shed. Pilate, whether out of cultural awareness, calculated political theatre, or some more personal need to externalize and dismiss his own guilt, appropriated this Jewish ritual for himself. Notice the declaration that accompanied the gesture: "I am innocent of the blood of this just person." Even in the act of ordering the execution, he called Jesus a just person, innocent. Even as he condemned him, he testified to his innocence. There is something almost unbearable about that. The verdict and the condemnation coexist in the same sentence, from the same mouth, in the same moment. He was innocent. Here is the order to kill him. The crowd's response, "His blood be on us and on our children," has been tragically misused over centuries as a basis for anti-Semitic persecution, as though it committed all Jewish people for all time to collective guilt for the death of Jesus. This is a profound misreading of the text and of Christian theology. It was a specific crowd at a specific moment, making a specific choice. The New Testament is clear that the death of Jesus was foreknown by God, that it was the fulfillment of Scripture, and that it was for the sins of all humanity, including every person who has ever lived, of every ethnicity and background. To use this verse as a weapon against Jewish people is to fundamentally misunderstand the gospel it is part of. But back to Pilate. Did the hand-washing accomplish what he intended? In the most immediate, practical sense, it allowed him to render a verdict he could temporarily rationalize as being out of his hands. The crowd wanted it. He gave them what they wanted. He declared himself innocent. He washed his hands. But water cannot wash away knowledge. Water cannot wash away the truth that you knew. Water cannot cleanse a conscience that is stained not by accident or ignorance, but by deliberate choice. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. He had said it multiple times. He had tried, at least fitfully, to find a way to release him, and then he had chosen not to. The choice was his, the authority was his, the order was his, and no amount of water in a basin or in an ocean could change that. Part 12, Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. After Pilate ordered Jesus to be scourged, a punishment of horrific brutality in which a bound prisoner was beaten with a flagellum, a whip embedded with pieces of bone and metal that tore the flesh with each stroke, the soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and subjected him to a sadistic mockery of his claims. They wove a crown from thorns and jammed it onto his head. They draped a purple robe, the color of royalty, around his bleeding shoulders. They came to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Then Pilate brought him outside again, before the crowd, in this condition. The man who had entered the praetorium standing straight in quiet dignity came out beaten, bleeding, thorn-crowned, robed in purple mockery. And Pilate said, in what is perhaps the most haunting single phrase in the entire Passion narrative, "Behold the man, Ecce Homo." Look at this man. What did Pilate mean by it? Several interpretations have been proposed, and none of them can be entirely ruled out. Perhaps it was a final appeal to the crowd's mercy. See how he has been treated. See his condition. Surely you are satisfied. Surely this is enough. Perhaps it was a kind of dark comedy. Here is your king, look at him. Perhaps it was something more existential, a moment where even Pilate was struck by something in Jesus's bearing, even in this condition, that made him want to point at him and say, "There is something about this man. Look at him." What we know is that the phrase transcended its immediate context. Ecce Homo became one of the most famous utterances in Western civilization. Artists across centuries, Fra Angelico, Hieronymus Bosch, Caravaggio, Rembrandt, Titian, Van Dyck, countless others, painted scenes titled Ecce Homo. The phrase appears in literature, in philosophy, in music. Nietzsche, the philosopher who declared the death of God, titled one of his most important works Ecce Homo in what was clearly a deliberate act of self-mythologization, claiming for himself the phrase that had been used to point at Jesus. But in its original context, the phrase pointed at Jesus, "Behold the man," and the man it pointed at was the Son of God, bearing the consequences of human cruelty, standing in the gap between heaven and earth, absorbing into himself the violence and the mockery and the injustice and the sin that was being poured out on him, not as a victim, but as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Even Pilate in that moment was pointing at Jesus. Even the instrument of condemnation was, without knowing it, bearing witness. Part 13. What I have written, I have written. There is one more moment in the trial narrative that deserves sustained attention, and it is often overlooked in the focus on the more dramatic elements. After the condemnation, after the crown of thorns and the purple robe, after Barabbas was released and the sentence was passed, Pilate ordered an inscription to be placed on the cross above the head of Jesus. It was standard Roman practice for crucified criminals to have the cause of their condemnation displayed on the cross as a public deterrent. Pilate's inscription read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." In Latin, the official language of Roman governance, the initials of this phrase are INRI, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, and John tells us it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek, the three great languages of the Mediterranean world. The chief priests were furious. They went to Pilate, almost immediately, and demanded a correction. "Do not write the King of the Jews," they said. "Write instead," he said, "I am the King of the Jews." The difference matters enormously. The inscription, as Pilate had written it, was a declaration, as a statement of fact. The version they wanted was merely a reported claim. Someone said something that may or may not be true. They wanted the inscription qualified. They wanted it softened. They wanted it to be clear that Rome was not affirming anything about Jesus's actual identity or status, and Pilate, who had caved to every other significant pressure the chief priests had applied throughout the morning, refused. His response, one of the most famous and final words he speaks in the Gospel record, was absolute. "What I have written, I have written." It is one of the most striking moments in Pilate's entire story. Here is a man who has just betrayed everything he professed to believe about justice and truth, who has just washed his hands of an innocent man's blood in front of a crowd, who has just ordered the execution of someone he declared not guilty. And yet, when the chief priests asked him to change the inscription, he planted his feet. He would not budge. "What I have written, I have written." Why? We can only speculate. Perhaps it was belated stubbornness. Having been manipulated all morning, he found one small area where he could reassert his authority. Perhaps it was a kind of unconscious witness. Something in him recognized that what he had written was true, even if he would not act on that truth in ways that mattered. Perhaps it was simply wounded Roman pride, unwilling to be pushed around one more time by the people who had leveraged him into the worst decision of his life. Perhaps it was all of these things at once. Whatever the reason, the result was remarkable. Pilate's declaration, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," remained on the cross. Written in three languages, visible to everyone who passed by. A proclamation of truth, authorized by the man who had condemned him, displayed above the head of the dying Son of God. Even in the act of his crucifixion, the truth about Jesus was proclaimed. Even through the instrument of Roman governance and political cowardice, the word went out, in Hebrew, in Latin, in Greek, to Jews and Romans and Greeks. The King of the Jews, the King of everything. God does not waste even the broken gestures of compromised men. Part 14. The years after the cross. And now we come to the part of Pilate's story that most people do not know, because the story does not end with the hand-washing and the inscription and the cross. Pilate continued. He continued as governor of Judea for several more years. He continued to administer, to judge, to command, to tax. Life went on, at least outwardly, in the praetorium and in the halls of Roman governance. But the world had been split in two by what had happened on Golgotha. Even if Pilate did not fully understand that, and he almost certainly did not in the theological terms we understand it, the reverberations were already beginning. 3 days after the crucifixion, reports began circulating through Jerusalem that the tomb was empty, that the body of Jesus was not where it had been placed, that he had been seen alive by his followers, that he had spoken to them, that he had eaten with them, that he had shown them his hands and his side. These reports must have reached Pilate. They were too significant, too publicly discussed, too widespread to have been contained within the small community of Jesus' followers. The chief priests certainly knew about them. Matthew's gospel records that they went to Pilate immediately, asking him to secure the tomb, precisely because they feared a claim of resurrection. Pilate posted a guard, and then the tomb was empty anyway. And the guards reported what had happened and were paid to say the body had been stolen. Did Pilate believe the reports of resurrection? Did he investigate them? Did they cause him to question, even privately, whether the verdict of that morning had been not just politically costly, but cosmically catastrophic? The historical record is silent. We have no account of Pilate's private thoughts or reactions in the days and weeks and months following the crucifixion. If he wrote anything down, it has not survived. If he confided in anyone, they did not record it. He is simply absent from the historical record on these points. What we do know is that he continued to govern for somewhere between 6 and 10 more years, depending on the precise date of the crucifixion and the precise date of his removal from office. 6 to 10 years of carrying out the daily business of Roman administration in the province where he had condemned the man he had called just. 6 to 10 years of seeing Jerusalem, of hearing the name of Jesus increasingly discussed and argued about in the streets, of watching the movement that the crucifixion was supposed to have ended somehow grow larger with every passing year. We do not know how he felt about any of it, but we know he was there. Part 15. The end of the governorship, removed in disgrace. The end of Pontius Pilate's governorship came not gradually but suddenly, and it came not because of anything connected to Jesus, but because of yet another religious controversy with yet another messianic figure. This time, the people involved were Samaritans, the ethnically and religiously mixed people of the central hill country of ancient Israel, who were regarded with considerable hostility by many Jews, but who had their own deep religious traditions and their own messianic expectations. Josephus records the incident in his Antiquities. A man, unnamed by Josephus, but clearly functioning as a prophetic or messianic figure in the eyes of his followers, gathered a large crowd at the foot of Mount Gerizim, which was the sacred mountain of Samaritan worship. He had promised to show them sacred vessels that he claimed had been buried there by Moses, a claim deeply charged with religious and messianic significance for Samaritans, who believed that the great day of the Lord would involve the revelation of such hidden sacred objects on Mount Gerizim. The crowd that assembled was large. They came armed, Josephus says, though whether this is accurate or an interpretation designed to justify Pilate's response is hard to know. Pilate's response was swift and overwhelming. He sent cavalry and infantry to intercept the crowd before it could reach the mountain. The soldiers blocked their path. Those in the village where the crowd had gathered were killed. The leaders of the movement were arrested and executed. By Pilate's logic, this was probably a straightforward security operation. A large armed gathering at a religiously charged location during a period when messianic movements had a history of escalating into violence. This was exactly the kind of situation a Roman prefect was supposed to prevent and suppress. He had suppressed it. Problem solved. But the Samaritan Council did not see it that way. They filed a formal complaint, not to Pilate but over his head, directly to Lucius Vitellius, the Roman legate of Syria. Vitellius was Pilate's superior in the regional hierarchy, the highest Roman official in the eastern Mediterranean. The Samaritan complaint was that the crowd had been peaceful, that they had gathered not for armed insurrection, but for religious devotion, and that Pilate had massacred innocent people. Vitellius investigated. Whatever he found, or whatever political calculus he applied, he concluded that action was warranted. He removed Pilate from his post and ordered him to travel to Rome to answer to the Emperor Tiberius for his actions in the Samaritan affair. Pilate's 10-year governorship of Judea was over. The manner of its ending was not a triumphant recall, a governor who had served well and was being rewarded with a better posting. It was a forced removal to face charges before the emperor. It was, in the language of political careers, a catastrophe. Everything Pilate had worked for, everything he had protected, even at the cost of condemning an innocent man, had failed to protect him in the end. He set out for Rome under the shadow of an imperial investigation. He traveled west, away from Judea, away from Jerusalem, away from the province where he had governed, and the mourning that would define him forever. And as he traveled, something happened that changed everything about his situation. Part 16. The emperor dies, and Pilate disappears into history. Tiberius died on March 16th, AD 37. He died at his villa on the island of Capri, where he had spent much of his later reign in increasingly reclusive isolation. Some ancient sources suggest his death was natural, old age and illness. Others hint at more dramatic circumstances involving the influence of Caligula, his successor, and the powerful men around the court. Whatever the truth of how Tiberius died, the fact is that he was gone before Pilate could face him. Pilate had been ordered to stand before Tiberius and answer for the Samaritan incident, and by the time he arrived in Rome, or shortly after, the emperor he was supposed to stand before was dead. Caligula, Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, became emperor. He was only 24 years old. He had been enormously popular with the people and the army, but his reign would quickly become one of the most disturbing in Roman imperial history. The man who was celebrated at his accession as a breath of fresh air after the gloomy, suspicious Tiberius would within months be exhibiting behavior that ancient sources describe as erratic, grandiose, and increasingly tyrannical. In this new political environment, what happened to Pontius Pilate? The historical record simply does not tell us. After Josephus's account of his recall and the death of Tiberius, the name Pontius Pilate disappears from the pages of official history. There is no account of his trial, no account of his acquittal, no account of a new posting, no account of his return to public life. Silence. This silence is itself historically significant. Important Roman officials who were tried and acquitted, or who were merely recalled and reassigned, left traces in the record. Their subsequent careers, their writings, their social presence generated documentation. The complete absence of Pilate from the record after his recall strongly suggests that his career did not recover. He did not bounce back. He did not resume the kind of public life that leaves records. Whether he died in exile, died in poverty, died by his own hand, or simply faded into private life in some corner of the empire, we cannot say with certainty from the historical sources. What we can say is that the man who had wielded the power of life and death over hundreds of thousands of people in Judea, the man who had hosted the trial of the century in his own praetorium, the man whose name would be inscribed in the Apostles' Creed and recited by billions of Christians across all of time, that man simply disappeared from history. He left no legacy of achievement, he left no great works, he left no dynasty. He left his name in stone in Caesarea, and he left his name in the Creed, and otherwise the silence swallowed him. Part 17. The traditions that filled the silence. Because official history went silent on Pilate's fate, tradition rushed in to fill the void. And the traditions that developed in the early church, in medieval Christianity, in the Eastern churches, are varied, dramatic, and collectively revealing about how Christian communities across the centuries thought about this man who had condemned their Lord. The early Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century in his monumental ecclesiastical history, gives us the most systematic early Christian summary of what was believed about Pilate's end. Eusebius writes that many great misfortunes fell upon Pilate during the reign of Caligula. He records the tradition, apparently widespread in his time, that Pilate was forced to become his own murderer and punished himself with his own hand. Suicide. Eusebius frames this in explicitly providential terms. Divine justice overtook the man who had handed over an innocent man to be crucified. Eusebius is careful to note that he is recording a tradition, not something he can personally verify from primary documents. He is a historian, and he treats his sources with a historian's awareness of their limitations. But the fact that he records this tradition at all, and that he frames it the way he does, tells us something about how the early church thought about Pilate's trajectory. The assumption was that his life did not end well. The assumption was that the guilt of that morning found him eventually. There is also a body of early Christian literature known collectively as the Pilate literature. Apocryphal and pseudepigraphical texts that develop the story of Pontius Pilate in various directions. The most significant of these is the Acts of Pilate, sometimes incorporated into a larger work called the Gospel of Nicodemus. This text purports to be an official Roman report of the trial of Jesus, written by Pilate himself and sent to the emperor. In some versions, Pilate's report is a kind of involuntary testimony. Despite himself, he ends up documenting the trial and resurrection of Jesus in a way that functions as official Roman confirmation of Christian claims. The Acts of Pilate is not historically reliable as a document of events. It was probably written in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century, long after the events it describes. But it tells us something important about how the early church thought about Pilate. They were fascinated by him. They wanted to know what he thought. They wanted to imagine his retrospective view of what had happened. They wanted him somehow to testify to the truth he had glimpsed and then walked away from. Some early Christian traditions are surprisingly sympathetic to Pilate. Tertullian, the brilliant North African theologian of the late 2nd century, made the remarkable statement that Pilate was already a Christian in his conscience. This claim is striking and is based primarily on Pilate's repeated declarations of Jesus' innocence, his evident reluctance to condemn him, and traditions about his subsequent conversion. Tertullian was using Pilate's behavior during the trial as evidence that even a Roman official, confronted with the evidence of Jesus' character and the unreasonableness of the charges against him, could recognize the truth. The Eastern churches developed their sympathetic traditions about Pilate most fully. The Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt, one of the ancient Christian churches, with roots going back to the very earliest centuries of Christianity, actually venerates both Pontius Pilate and his wife Claudia Procula as saints. The feast day of Pilate and Procula in the Coptic calendar falls on June 25th. In this tradition, Pilate's handwashing and his declaration of Jesus' innocence, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person," are understood as his way of publicly confessing that Jesus was righteous, and his subsequent conversion to Christianity is affirmed as tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has a similar tradition, venerating Pilate as a saint who ultimately recognized Jesus' identity and came to faith. These traditions represent a genuinely different theological interpretation of Pilate's role from the dominant Western Christian tradition. Whether they are historically grounded or represent a later theological development meant to emphasize that even those who participated in Jesus' death could be redeemed by grace is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. But they have persisted for over a millennium in living Christian communities, and they deserve to be taken seriously as theological statements, even if they cannot be verified as historical facts. Part 18. Mount Pilatus, a name carved by legend. Perhaps no tradition connected to Pontius Pilate is more visually striking or more geographically specific than the one that connects him to a mountain in the Swiss Alps. Mount Pilatus rises above the city of Lucerne in central Switzerland, and it is one of the most dramatic and beautiful peaks in the entire Alpine range. The mountain has been a place of legend and wonder for centuries, and according to a tradition that goes back at least to medieval times, it takes its name from Pontius Pilate. The story, in its various versions, goes something like this. After his death, whether by suicide, execution, or other means, the body of Pontius Pilate was thrown into the Tiber River in Rome. But the Tiber, according to the legend, refused to accept it. The river was troubled, disturbed, producing storms and turbulence wherever the body was present. The body was then transported to various rivers and lakes in France and Switzerland, each of which responded similarly with violent and unusual weather, as though the earth itself was rejecting the man who had condemned the Son of God. Finally, it was deposited in a deep mountain lake near what is now Lucerne, and that lake, and the mountain above it, came to be associated with Pilate's name. Is any of this historically true? Almost certainly not in any literal sense. It belongs squarely to the genre of medieval legend, the kind of story that attaches itself to notorious historical figures and develops over generations of retelling, accruing detail, and elaboration with each iteration. The mountain's name may derive from the Latin word pileatus, meaning something like capped or wearing a hat, referring to the cap of cloud that frequently covers the mountain's summit. This is a more prosaic, but probably more accurate explanation of the name. But the legend is revealing. The human imagination, confronted with the figure of Pontius Pilate, wants him to be somewhere, wants him to have a final resting place, a destination, an end. The legend of Mount Pilatus represents the longing for resolution, for the story to have a definitive ending, for the man who tried to wash his hands of guilt to ultimately be placed somewhere. The earth rejects him. Rivers push him away. He ends up in a cold, deep alpine lake beneath a mountain that will carry his name forever. Whether this is history or poetry, it captures something true. You cannot escape the weight of what you have done. The rivers and the lakes of legend would not receive him, and in a deeper sense, neither would history. Part 19. Pilate in Art and Philosophy, a presence that never fades. One of the most remarkable aspects of Pontius Pilate's legacy is the way he has continued to fascinate artists, writers, and philosophers across 20 centuries. He is not simply a historical figure, he is an archetype. He is the embodiment of a particular kind of human failure, intelligent, perceptive, morally aware, and ultimately unwilling to act on his awareness. The great painters of the Renaissance and Baroque periods returned to Pilate again and again. Albrecht Dürer, Caravaggio, Rembrandt, Hieronymus Bosch, all painted scenes from the Passion that included Pilate, and their interpretations varied remarkably. Rembrandt's depiction of the trial catches the anguish on Pilate's face. A man who knows he is making a terrible mistake and is making it anyway. Bosch's Ecce Homo emphasizes the grotesque carnival atmosphere of the crowd, placing Pilate as a figure almost overwhelmed by the chaos around him. These artists were not just depicting historical events, they were exploring the psychology of moral failure, and they found in Pilate a figure rich enough to bear the weight of that exploration. In literature, Pilate appears in works ranging from the medieval mystery plays that dramatized the Passion story for popular audiences to the great romantic and modern writers who engaged with the question of his guilt and his fate. Mikhail Bulgakov, the great Russian novelist, made Pontius Pilate one of the central characters of his masterpiece, The Master and Margarita, a novel that interweaves scenes from the trial of Jesus with a darkly satirical portrait of Stalinist Moscow. Bulgakov's Pilate is a man haunted, unable to forget the conversation he had with the prisoner, his life thereafter defined by the choice he made that morning. In Bulgakov's telling, Pilate's sin is not hatred of Jesus, but cowardice, the failure of a brave man to be brave when it mattered most. Bulgakov called cowardice the worst sin of all. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who, as we noted, titled one of his major works Ecce Homo, engaged with Pilate's question about truth in ways that were intended to subvert Christian claims. For Nietzsche, what is truth was not a question to be answered by the Christian gospel, but a question that exposed the pretensions of all absolute truth claims. But even Nietzsche's engagement with Pilate's question is a testament to the power and persistence of that moment. He could not escape the scene. Neither, it seems, can anyone. Part 20. What Pilate represents, the mirror. We cannot look away from. We have traveled a long way through history, archaeology, theology, art, and tradition. And now I want to turn from the external record to the internal one, because the most important thing about Pontius Pilate is not what we find in the archaeology or the ancient sources or the medieval legends. The most important thing about him is what we find when we hold his story up as a mirror and look honestly at what it reflects. Pontius Pilate is one of the great mirrors in Scripture. Not because he was uniquely evil, he was not, and that is precisely the point. He was not a monster by the standards of his time or ours. He was a man of intelligence, of some moral awareness, of genuine perception. He could see when something was unjust. He could identify innocence when he interrogated it. He was capable of resisting pressure, as the inscription affair showed. He was capable of decent impulses, as his repeated attempts to release Jesus show. And he failed. Catastrophically, historically, eternally failed. Not because he lacked the capacity to do right, not because he could not see the truth, but because when the moment came, when truth stood before him in person and the cost of honoring it was made explicit, he chose the safer option. He chose his career. He chose the crowd. He chose the man who was not Caesar's friend, rather than be the man who was not Caesar's friend. This is not a failure unique to Pontius Pilate. This is one of the most fundamental and recurring failures of human nature. And that is why his story will not stay in the first century. That is why it keeps breaking through into every generation, finding echoes in every era, confronting every individual who reads it with uncomfortable recognition. How many times have you known the right thing to do and done the safer thing instead? How many times has the crowd been louder than your conscience? How many times have you stood in a moment of decision, at work, in a relationship, in a community, in a family, where you knew clearly what was right, and you also knew that doing the right thing would cost you something you were not ready to give? Maybe it would cost you approval. Maybe it would cost you belonging. Maybe it would cost you a promotion, a friendship, a comfortable relationship with powerful people. Maybe it would cost you the social capital you had spent years accumulating. And in that moment, with the metaphorical basin of water within reach, did you wash your hands? Did you find a way to tell yourself that the verdict you were about to render was not really your responsibility? That the pressure you were under was sufficient justification for the compromise you were making? That you were innocent of whatever wrong was about to occur? If you have never felt that temptation, you have not yet been tested in the places that matter most. Because Pilate's temptation is the universal temptation of human beings who live in communities, who depend on approval, who have something to lose. It is the temptation that Paul describes in Galatians when he talks about living to please people rather than God. It is the temptation that the prophets faced every time they had to speak a word that the powerful did not want to hear. It is the temptation that every person of conscience faces when the cost of integrity becomes real. The difference between the person who yields to this temptation and the person who does not is not intelligence, it is not perception, it is not even knowledge. Pilate had all three. The difference is the willingness to pay the cost of what you know to be true. The willingness to say, even when the crowd is shouting and the career is on the line, I will not do this. I know what is right. I know who this person is. I will not betray them for my own comfort. That willingness, that costly, demanding, sometimes career-ending courage, is what Pilate lacked, and its absence cost him everything. Not just his career, as it turned out, everything. Part 21. The question that still demands an answer. What is truth? Pontius Pilate asked this question and left the room. He did not wait for an answer. And perhaps, in the immediate moment, he thought he had been clever. Perhaps he thought the rhetorical question dismissed the conversation, moved things along, allowed him to get back to the practical business of managing the crowd outside. Perhaps he thought it made him look philosophically sophisticated, too worldly, too experienced, too aware of the complexity of things to be taken in by claims of absolute truth. But the question did not go away. It never went away. It has been going for 2,000 years now, and it shows no signs of stopping. It echoes through every generation of human thought, every philosophical school, every court of law that has ever tried to establish what actually happened and what it means. What is truth? How do we know it? How do we access it? Is it discoverable or is it constructed? Is it objective or is it always relative to the one claiming it? Can it be stood in front of, questioned and recognized? These are not idle academic questions. They are the questions that determine how human beings live together, what we build our communities on, what we use as the standard for justice, what we appeal to when we say something is wrong and needs to be corrected. Every court of law that has ever sat in session has been, in some sense, still wrestling with Pilate's question. Every philosophical system that has ever tried to ground ethics in something more than preference or power has been, in some sense, still working on an answer. And standing right in front of Pilate's question, literally physically in that room in Jerusalem, was the answer. The one who said, I am the truth. Not one truth, not an approximation of truth. The truth. The Logos. The word, the reason, the logic of the universe, made flesh, standing in a courtroom, being questioned by the man who held the power of life and death. Pilate's question was not wrong. The question itself was right. It is the most important question a human being can ask. What is truth? That is the question. The tragedy of Pilate was not that he asked it. It was that he asked it and walked away before the answer could reach him. And the invitation, the astonishing, persistent 2,000-year-old invitation, is to ask the same question and stay. To ask it honestly, with an open hand and a willing heart. To be prepared for the answer to cost you something, because it will. Truth always does, but to stay and receive it. Because the cost of receiving truth, however high it seems, is infinitely lower than the cost of walking away from it. Part 22, the cross he authorized. And what it accomplished here is the deepest irony, the most staggering reversal, the most overwhelmingly grace-saturated truth in this entire story. The cross that Pontius Pilate authorized became the salvation of the world. The verdict that was wrong, the condemnation of an innocent man, accomplished what no just verdict could ever have accomplished. The execution that was unjust, the killing of the Son of God, destroyed death itself. The blood that Pilate tried to wash off his hands, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person," became the blood that washes away the guilt of every human being who has ever lived, including in the breathtaking mathematics of divine grace, Pontius Pilate himself. This is not a comfortable truth. It is a staggering one, but it is the truth at the center of the gospel. God did not merely allow the crucifixion, God planned it. Before the foundation of the world, before Rome existed, before Judea was a province, before the Herodian dynasty was built, before the Sanhedrin convened, before Judas made his deal and Peter denied and Pilate washed his hands, God had determined that the Son would go to the cross, not as a reaction to human failure, not as plan B because plan A fell apart, as the eternal plan. The Lamb was slain, as Revelation puts it, from the foundation of the world. This means that every person involved in the crucifixion, the chief priests, Judas, the soldiers, Pilate, the crowd, was, without knowing it, participating in the most profound act of divine love in all of creation. Their guilt was real. Their choices were real, their moral failures were real, and at the same time God was working through all of it, the betrayal, the cowardice, the violence, the injustice, to accomplish the redemption of humanity. If you have ever wondered how God can be in control of a world where things go this badly wrong, where innocence is condemned and guilt is released, and the crowd chooses Barabbas and the governor washes his hands, this is part of the answer. Not the whole answer, but part of it. God does not cause evil, but he is sovereign over it. He takes the worst that human sin and cowardice can produce and turns it into the instrument of eternal grace. He takes the cross, the symbol of Roman execution, the most shameful and painful death the ancient world had devised, and turns it into the symbol of the greatest love the universe has ever known. That does not excuse Pilate. It does not make his choice less culpable, but it does mean that even Pilate's failure was not outside the reach of God's purposes. It was woven into them, used, redeemed, transformed. And if God can do that, with the worst moral failure in human history, the condemnation of his own Son, then there is no failure in your life that is too far gone for his redemptive purposes, no mistake too large, no compromise too entrenched, no basket too deep. The God who worked through Golgotha can work through anything, anything. Part 23, suffered under Pontius Pilate, the creed and its weight. Every Sunday in churches and chapels and cathedrals and house groups and online prayer rooms across the globe, in hundreds of languages and dozens of liturgical traditions, Christians around the world stand together and recite the Apostles' Creed. It is one of the oldest continuous acts of collective human testimony in existence. For nearly 2,000 years, the faithful have stood and said these words, "I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. suffered under Pontius Pilate. His name, in the creed, every Sunday, everywhere. He tried to wash his hands of Jesus. He declared himself innocent. He tried, with a basin of water and a public gesture, to distance himself from what he was doing, and instead, his name is permanently welded to the story of Jesus' suffering, not as an honor, not as a celebration, as a historical anchor, as a statement that this really happened in real time, in a real place, under a real Roman official. The reason the creed includes this specific historical detail is theological and apologetic. It is grounding the story of Jesus' death in verifiable, datable world historical events. It is saying, this is not mythology, this is not allegory, this is not a spiritual narrative that exists outside of time and space. This happened on a specific day, in a specific city, under the governance of a specific Roman official named Pontius Pilate. You can look him up. You can find the stone. You can verify the office. This happened. But for Pilate himself, being in the creed means something else. It means that the man who wanted to be free of this story, who wanted to wash his hands of it and get back to his career and his comfortable life, is instead permanently, inextricably, unavoidably attached to it. Every creed recited is a testimony to what Jesus endured, and every creed recited includes his name as the instrument of that endurance. He wanted out. He got in. Forever. There is something almost unbearably instructive about this. You cannot exempt yourself from the consequences of your choices by declaring yourself exempt. You cannot opt out of the moral weight of a decision simply by announcing that you are innocent. Pilate announced his innocence with water and words, and history recorded his guilt with stone and creed. Part 24. Lessons from the life and end of Pontius Pilate. We have traveled through history, theology, archaeology, tradition, art, and reflection. And now I want to bring it all together into the lessons that Pilate's story teaches. The hard-won, historically grounded, spiritually urgent truths that emerge from this examination of the man who condemned Jesus. The first lesson is the most fundamental. Knowledge of the truth is not the same as obedience to it. Pilate knew. He knew that Jesus was innocent. He knew it from his own interrogation. He knew it from his wife's warning. He knew it from the evidence of envy in the chief priests' faces. He declared it repeatedly, and he condemned Jesus anyway. This tells us something terrifying and important about human nature. It is entirely possible to perceive the truth clearly and still choose not to act on it. Clarity of perception is not the same as moral courage. Knowing what is right is not the same as doing it. The disciples of Jesus heard the same teaching as the religious leaders who opposed him. The religious leaders who delivered Jesus to Pilate knew the scriptures better than almost anyone, and they killed the one the scriptures were about. Knowledge alone does not save. It takes surrender. It takes the willingness to let what you know remake your life. The second lesson is that moral compromise is cumulative and progressive. Pilate did not arrive at the condemnation of Jesus as a fresh, morally uncorrupted man, making his first serious ethical mistake. He arrived there at the end of a decade of smaller compromises: the Standards Incident, the Temple Treasury Affair, the Galilean slaughter, the Shields controversy. Each time he chose political calculation over principle, each time he made the pragmatic decision rather than the right one, he became a little more capable of the next compromise. The cords of habitual moral cowardice wound around a man's soul, one experience at a time, eventually become chains. We do not become Pilate in a single dramatic moment. We become him through the accumulated choices of days and months and years spent prioritizing our comfort, our career, our social standing over the demands of integrity. The warning is urgent. Guard the small choices. They are forming you. The third lesson is that the crowd is not a moral authority. Pilate rendered his ultimate verdict not on the basis of his own judgment, which he had already expressed clearly, "I find no fault in him," but on the basis of what the crowd demanded. He was afraid of the tumult. He was afraid of the noise. He was afraid of what they would do, and so he gave them what they wanted. But the crowd was wrong. The crowd called for the release of a man imprisoned for murder and the execution of the Son of God. The crowd's collective voice was, in this case, not a guide to justice, but its antithesis. This has happened before, and it will happen again. The majority is not always right. The loudest voice is not always the truest one. The most intense public pressure is not always pointing toward what is good and just and holy. We must cultivate the ability to stand against the crowd when the crowd is wrong, to have an internal compass that is calibrated not to social pressure, but to truth. That is not easy, but it is essential. The fourth lesson is that position and power are not permanent protections. Pilate spent a decade trying to maintain his position in Judea, making political calculations, managing relationships, suppressing uprisings, placating Rome, staying on the right side of the emperor. He compromised justice to protect his career, and then he lost the career anyway. The governor of Judea ended up recalled in disgrace, his fate a matter of ancient tradition and legend rather than historical record, his ultimate end probably lonely and certainly tragic. Position does not protect you. Power does not save you. The things we sacrifice our integrity to obtain have a way of slipping away from us regardless. And when they go, they take with them everything we traded for them. The only thing that endures is what is built on truth. The fifth lesson is this: God's purposes are not hostage to human failure. This is the most comforting truth in the entire story, and it needs to be said clearly. Pilate's cowardice led to the crucifixion of Jesus, and the crucifixion of Jesus was the salvation of the world. God did not need Pilate to do the right thing in order to accomplish his purposes. He worked through Pilate's failure, through the religious leaders' conspiracy, through Judas's betrayal, through the soldiers' cruelty, through the crowd's bloodlust. And he brought out of all of it the greatest act of redemptive love in all of human history. This does not absolve any of them. Their choices were real and their accountability is real, but it does tell us something extraordinary about the God we serve. He is not stopped by our failures. He is not detoured by our compromises. He is not defeated by our cowardice. He is the God who brings life out of death, who brings redemption out of injustice, who writes straight lines with the crooked instruments of human sin. And he can do the same with your failures and mine. The sixth and final lesson is perhaps the most personal. There is grace even for a Pontius Pilate. We do not know the final state of his soul. That is God's knowledge, not ours. What we do know is that the one he condemned prayed for those who were crucifying him. Father, forgive them. The scope of that prayer, them, was not narrow. It was wide enough to include the soldiers driving the nails, wide enough to include the crowd shouting at the foot of the cross, wide enough to include the religious leaders who engineered the whole proceeding, and wide enough, more than wide enough, to include the Roman governor who declared his innocence and signed the death warrant. Whether Pontius Pilate ever received that forgiveness is something only God knows. But the offer was made from the cross itself. In the middle of his own suffering, the one Pilate condemned offered grace to those who condemned him. That is the kind of God we are dealing with. That is the cross that Pilate authorized, and the grace it unleashed was wider than anyone, including Pilate, could have imagined. Part 25. Standing in the same room. 2,000 years have passed since that morning in Jerusalem. The praetorium is rubble beneath the streets of a modern city. The crowd is long gone. The chief priests are dust. The Roman Empire that gave Pilate his title and his authority has been gone for 1,500 years. The very language, Latin, that Pilate used is now a dead language taught in universities rather than spoken in the streets. And yet, the scene endures. It endures in the creed, in the stone, in the art, in the philosophy, in the literature, in the perpetual human fascination with what happened that morning. It endures because it is not just a story from the past, it is the story of the present. It is happening now in different forms, in different contexts, in every human heart that encounters the claim of Jesus Christ and has to decide what to do with it. You are, in some sense, in the room, not the same room, not the first-century praetorium with its stone floors and Roman soldiers and the smell of a city full of Passover pilgrims, but the same essential encounter. Truth is standing before you, in the pages of the Gospels, in the testimony of the risen Christ, in the witness of the Holy Spirit, in the community of believers who across 20 centuries have staked their lives on the claim that Jesus is Lord and that death could not hold him. And the question that Pilate asked, the right question, asked in the wrong spirit, walked away from before the answer came, is before you too. What is truth? You can ask it the way Pilate asked it, rhetorically, dismissively, as a conversation ender, as a way of saying there is no definitive answer. So let's move on to the practical business of managing the crowd. You can use it to inoculate yourself against the demands of the gospel, to protect yourself from the cost of receiving the answer. Or you can ask it the way it was meant to be asked, genuinely, honestly, with an open hand, willing to receive whatever the answer turns out to be, and to let that answer reorganize everything, willing to stay in the room, willing to let the truth that is a person, not merely a proposition, not merely a set of doctrines, but a living, risen, present person who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, speak into your life and make of it something truer and deeper and more lasting than anything you could build on your own. That is the invitation. It has been extended for 2,000 years. It is extended now, today, to everyone who watches this video, from every country and culture and background on earth. Pilate walked away. The invitation does not. Closing. The legacy of a man who left his name in stone and creed. There is a certain kind of legacy that no one chooses. Pilate did not choose to be in the Apostles' Creed. He did not choose to have his name recited in churches around the world every Sunday for 20 centuries. He did not choose to have a mountain in Switzerland carry his name, or a stone bearing his title displayed in a museum in Jerusalem, or his story told and retold in art and literature and philosophy and theology in every generation since his death. He chose one thing: to protect himself. To choose safety over justice, comfort over truth, career over conscience. He made the calculation that his position was worth more than the life of a man he had declared innocent. And in making that calculation, he entered the permanent record of human history, not as a man who served Rome well. He was removed from office in disgrace, but as the man who condemned Jesus. That is his legacy. That is what survived. The inscription on the stone at Caesarea reads, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. It was probably meant to honor the emperor and memorialize Pilate's own administrative achievement. Instead, it serves primarily as archaeological confirmation of the gospel accounts of the trial of the Son of God. The man who tried to wash his hands of the story became inseparably part of it, and that is a warning and an invitation all at once. A warning: you cannot escape the moral weight of your choices by declaring yourself exempt. You cannot wash away guilt with ceremony. The choices we make, especially the choices we make when truth is standing right in front of us and the crowd is loud and the cost of integrity is high, those choices define us in ways that outlast us. And an invitation. It is not too late. It was never too late, not even for Pilate, as long as he was alive and breathing and capable of turning around and going back into that room and receiving the answer to the question he had asked. The door did not close when he walked through it. The grace that poured out of the cross that he authorized was wide enough for him. It is wide enough for you. It is wide enough for every person watching this video today, wherever you are, whatever you have done, however many times you have been the person who asked the question and walked away before the answer came. The answer is still there, still waiting, still speaking, still offering himself, the way, the truth, and the life, to everyone who will stop, turn around, go back in, and receive him. Pontius Pilate's story ends in silence and tradition and legend. Yours does not have to. Friends, we have been on a long journey today, through history, through archaeology, through the scriptural record, through 20 centuries of tradition and reflection. If this video has moved you, challenged you, deepened your understanding of the passion of Christ and the astonishing complexity of the people involved in it, I am so glad, because this is exactly what this channel is here for. I want to ask you to do a few things before you leave. First, and I mean this from the very deepest place in my heart, please subscribe. If you are not yet part of this community and this content has blessed you, nourished you, given you something to think about and pray about and carry with you, please subscribe right now. Hit the subscribe button and then hit the notification bell so that you never miss when a new video goes up. This channel is committed to going deep into the Word of God, to bringing you content that is historically rigorous, theologically grounded, and spiritually alive. There is so much more coming, and I do not want you to miss any of it. Second, if this video has been a blessing to you, please share it. Send it to a friend who is asking questions about faith, or about Jesus, or about the historical reality behind the Gospels. Post it in a group. Share it on your social media. You never know whose heart is ready for exactly this kind of content, exactly this kind of deep, honest, historically rooted engagement with the story of Jesus and the people around him. Be the person who passes it on. Third, please like the video. I know it seems like a small thing, but every like genuinely helps this content reach more people who are searching for exactly what we do here. If this video blessed you, the like button is one of the best ways you can say thank you and help us grow. And fourth, stay tuned. We have videos coming that are going to take you deep into the stories, the history, the theology, and the human drama of the Bible in ways that will transform how you read Scripture and how you understand the God who inspired it. Every video we make is built to give you more historical context, more archaeological insight, more scriptural depth, more genuine encounter with the living Word of God. You are part of something global here. From the United States to the United Kingdom, from Brazil to Nigeria, from South Korea to South Africa, from the Philippines to France, people all over this beautiful, broken, beloved world are watching these videos and being nourished by the same Word of God. That is extraordinary. That is the body of Christ in action, and you are part of it. May God bless you richly and abundantly. May He guard your mind and strengthen your faith. May the story of Pontius Pilate serve both as a warning and as an invitation. A warning about the cost of walking away from truth, and an invitation to stay in the room, receive the answer, and let it change everything. The one who was condemned by Pilate is alive. He is risen. He is Lord. And He is still asking, through the pages of His Word and the witness of His Spirit, who do you say that I am? Stay in the room, receive the answer, and go into your week carrying the truth that no crowd can shout down and no basin of water can wash away. We'll see you in the next video. God bless you.